Next to me on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation in southern Idaho is the grave of Bannock War Chief, Chief Buffalo Horn. And to understand the 1878 Bannock War here in Idaho, you need to know the development of the Bannock as a people. As a culture, they came down from northern Idaho, where they used to associate with the northern Paiute. But their migration was led by the fact that the Shoshone at the southern end of Idaho were an equestrian culture. They knew how to ride horsebacks, and they were great warriors, and they spoke a very similar language. So around this time they head down and they're trading with the Hudson's Bay Company, they're trading with British fur trappers, and pretty soon the Rocky Mountain fur trade, early American mountain men and trappers, come through, and they form very mutually beneficial relationships with them as well. It's a very sparse kind of influx of settlers, and mostly they're just trappers that are there seasonally, and they kind of see them as a very good source of weapons and supplies and information from the East Coast. However, by the 1860s, settlers were streaming through with the Oregon Trail, creating a competition for resources which hadn't really existed before. So amid this, gold is discovered, and by that time, all bets are off for their survival as a people, and eventually the Idaho governor in 1866 gives the Bannock a refugee camp just outside of the territorial capital. And because of that, they're starving, the provisions are very low, and they're reliant on settlers who now have an increasingly negative view of them as kind of being a hand-to-mouth type people, when that's only the case because the settlers are there eating up all their food. So as the Nez Perce War begins in 1877, Chief Buffalo Horn forms an alliance with General Oliver O. Howard, thinking perhaps if I am to go and join this general and put down these other Native Americans up in the panhandle of Idaho, perhaps he'll give my people better provisions, a better reservation. But that was not the case at all. They were confined to their reservation, and it was 1.8 million acres, but the provisions were incredibly low, and again, they were starving by late 1877. So by early 1878, there's a series of murders on the reservation. One man, called Tay Pope, he kills a teamster, and as was tradition with these Native Americans, the onus was on the family to reach retribution. The man who had killed the teamster was either to be brutally beaten, or to have his property confiscated, or to be killed or executed himself by the tribal council. But U.S. authorities were requesting that they transfer this man over to them, and this reached a political head, and eventually a friend of the murderer went and killed a beef seller who had contracted. He was a white man contracting out of Fort Hall. So eventually this led to a conflict between the U.S. government, who was now cutting provisions left and right because of these incidents, and Chief Buffalo Horn leads 200 Bannock people over to the west along the Snake River Valley off the reservation, which is against the wishes of the government, which they now consider a warlike action, specifically because the Paiute are uprising in eastern Oregon. So as this is happening, Chief Buffalo Horn initially probably didn't even realize that they considered him a war party. He and his 200 young men were searching for food along the Snake River itself, heading into Boise along the old Oregon Trail. So eventually they reach a camp with cowboys in it, and they try to sell them a couple of hides. But a conflict ensues, and 2 cowboys are killed and 2 are injured, and they make their way down the river to tell another camp of white settlers what had happened. And Chief Buffalo Horn understood at this point that the war was on, and they needed to either fight or die trying. So they pushed out to the west into the south along the Owyhee River to meet a war party of Paiute, which they understood was down there, and they eventually got into a conflict out at South Mountain, where Chief Buffalo Horn was killed by white settlers at a small gold mining camp. And after this, the Bannock chose Chief Egan, who led them further into eastern Oregon. But their journey there would not be very long lasting, because at the John Day River they were headed off, and eventually this led Egan to go form camp somewhere out in the woods. But around this time, a Umatilla war party, because General Howard, who used to be Chief Buffalo Horn's ally, was using other Native American tribes with the promise that maybe you might get better provisions to ally against the Bannock. And a Umatilla war party came in, and saying that they were scouts for the U.S. government, they said, "Chief Egan, we would like to negotiate with you." And then as soon as Chief Egan had let his guard down, they scalped his elderly mother and left her to die in a ditch before beheading Chief Egan himself. Now this pretty much ended the war. There were small skirmishes afterwards, and basically these warriors, as the government called them, they were only forced to be warriors. They had only intended to bring food to their people. They were sent to other reservations that were far removed from the Fort Hall Reservation here. They were sent over to the Malheur Reservation, the Duck Valley Reservation, and a couple of other places where they were basically left to live and starve for many years before a lot of them were eventually brought back here. And I think most interesting is the fact that Buffalo Horn, under General Howard, he allied with him, and he said that basically what drove him to do this was seeing that the settlers had trampled down a field that was sacred to them, that had provided them with a certain type of reed, a camas, that they would go and they would eat, and it was just, that was the last straw. So he let his men out to hunt for food, and the US government said it's war, so they sent troops from Nevada and Utah and Oregon and Idaho and all the western states, and eventually put these people down. But their story is a fascinating one here, just a mile away from the casino at Fort Hall.